It did not begin with helicopters, napalm, or screaming jungle firefights. It began quietly, with a lie of simplicity, that Vietnam was a small problem, far away and easily managed. But in reality, this was a slow burn trap, years in the making, where every decision narrowed the exit and every step forward made turning back politically impossible. In 1954, France's colonial grip on Indochina finally snapped after its humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu, ending nearly a century of foreign rule and leaving a power vacuum that terrified Washington, because to American strategists, Vietnam was no longer about independence. It was about dominoes, about the belief that if one country fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. At the Geneva Accords, Vietnam was split in two at the 17th parallel. The Communist North under Ho Chi Minh and the US-backed South under Ngo Dinh Diem, a division meant to be temporary, pending elections that never came, because American officials feared Ho Chi Minh would win in a landslide, turning a nationalist hero into a communist victory they could not accept. So the United States stayed quietly at first, sending money, weapons, and advisors, insisting this was not a war, but assistance. Yet those advisors trained South Vietnamese troops, planned operations, and slowly took responsibility for decisions on the ground, while Diem's corrupt and brutal regime alienated the very population it was supposed to protect. By the early 1960s, South Vietnam was bleeding from the inside. Buddhist protests filled the streets, villages slipped out of government control, and the Viet Cong grew stronger in the shadows, forcing Washington into a familiar Cold War panic. Either escalate and prove resolve, or risk appearing weak in a world obsessed with credibility. Then came August 1964 and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, murky naval encounters, exaggerated reports, and political urgency fused into a single congressional resolution that gave the US president sweeping war powers, and with that vote, the path was set. What had begun as advice and influence was now primed to become a full-scale war, long before most Americans realized they were already in it. By 1966, the war had slipped fully into the jungle, where visibility collapsed, maps lied, and the enemy refused to stand and fight, because the Viet Cong did not need to defeat American forces in open battle. They only needed to survive, harass, and exhaust them, turning every patrol into a psychological test rather than a tactical contest. The jungle itself became a weapon. Thick canopy blocking air support, tangled undergrowth slowing movement to a crawl, heat and humidity draining strength long before contact was made, while leeches, insects and disease wore soldiers down in ways no training exercise could prepare them for. Contact rarely came with warning. Sudden gunfire from invisible positions, booby traps hidden beneath leaves, mines triggered by a single careless step, creating an atmosphere where tension never released, where silence was more frightening than noise, and where every village path and tree line felt hostile. Beneath the ground, the enemy moved through vast tunnel networks that stored weapons, hid fighters, and allowed entire units to vanish after attacking, making American firepower feel blunt and ineffective as bombs and artillery shattered the surface while the war continued unseen below. Villages became moral minefields as civilians were caught between both sides, suspected by Americans, coerced by guerrillas, turning counterinsurgency into a grinding cycle of raids, relocations, and destruction that often created more enemies than it removed. By the end of 1967, American forces were fighting constantly, yet gaining no lasting ground, measuring success in numbers that failed to reflect reality, while the enemy endured, adapted, and waited. Because in the Jungle War, time itself had become the Viet Cong's most effective weapon. In March 1965, the war crossed a line that could never be uncrossed when the first US combat troops landed at Da Nang, not as advisors, not as trainers, but as soldiers sent to fight. and what had been sold to the American public as a limited commitment suddenly became a visible, irreversible war with boots in the mud and rifles loaded. American commanders arrived confident in technology, firepower, and doctrine, believing superior weapons and mobility would overwhelm a lightly equipped enemy. Yet they were stepping into a conflict where the battlefield had no front lines, no clear enemy formations, and no reliable way to distinguish fighters from civilians. The strategy was brutally simple. Search out the enemy, engage them, and measure success through body counts. But this logic rewarded destruction over control, turning villages into battle zones, forcing civilians into impossible choices, and allowing the enemy to melt away after each clash, only to return once the Americans had gone. Helicopters became the symbol of the new war. Airmobile assaults dropping troops into jungle clearings, extracting the wounded under fire, and giving the illusion of dominance. Yet every landing zone was a gamble, every descent a potential ambush, and the jungle erased advantages as quickly as they were gained. For many soldiers, the shock was immediate: oppressive heat, constant tension, invisible enemies, and missions that felt repetitive and pointless. While back home, political leaders insisted progress was being made, widening the gap between official optimism and the lived reality on the ground. By the end of 1965, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops were committed, casualties were rising, and victory still had no clear definition. Because the United States had entered a war it could escalate indefinitely, but could not clearly win, setting the stage for a long, grinding conflict that would test limits far beyond the battlefield. By early 1968, American leaders were telling the public the war was being won, enemy numbers were falling, and victory was only a matter of time. While on the ground, soldiers sensed something else entirely: an uneasy quiet. A feeling that the enemy was waiting, watching, and preparing for something far larger than the routine clashes of the jungle war. Then during the Tet holiday, traditionally a ceasefire, communist forces struck across South Vietnam in a coordinated wave, hitting cities, towns, air bases, and even the heart of Saigon itself, shattering the belief that the enemy was weak or incapable of large-scale operations. The assault on the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon lasted only hours, but its impact was enormous, because even though the attackers were killed, the image of enemy fighters inside the capital destroyed the illusion of control and exposed the gap between official statements and reality. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the Viet Cong, with massive casualties and no lasting territorial gains. Yet, psychologically, it was devastating for the United States, because Americans watching at home no longer believed claims of progress, seeing instead a war that seemed endless and uncontrollable. Television footage brought the fighting into living rooms: burning streets, wounded soldiers, terrified civilians, fueling protests, deepening divisions, and forcing the public to question not just how the war was being fought, but why it was being fought at all. After that, the war never recovered its narrative momentum. Trust in leadership collapsed, escalation lost public support, and although the fighting continued for years, 1968 marked the moment when the United States began to lose the war, not on the battlefield, but in belief, setting the stage for withdrawal, protest, and a reckoning that could no longer be avoided. After Tet, the war entered a hollow phase where fighting continued but belief did not, as American soldiers were still sent on patrols and missions, yet the sense of purpose that once justified the cost had eroded, replaced by exhaustion, cynicism, and the growing feeling that the war was being sustained by momentum rather than strategy. President Nixon promised a way out through Vietnamization, a plan to shift combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing U.S. troops. But on the ground, this often meant Americans fighting on while preparing their replacements, delaying departure rather than resolving the conflict. Morale inside the ranks deteriorated sharply. Drug use increased, discipline broke down, and trust between soldiers and commanders weakened, because many troops felt trapped in a war that no longer made sense, counting days rather than victories, measuring survival in rotations rather than objectives. Back in the United States, opposition hardened into mass protest. Campuses shut down, cities filled with demonstrators, and events like Kent State exposed how deeply the war had divided the country, turning Vietnam from a foreign conflict into a domestic crisis of authority, trust, and identity. Despite promises of de-escalation, the war widened into Cambodia and Laos, blurring its boundaries even further and convincing many Americans that withdrawal was being discussed publicly while escalation continued quietly, deepening the credibility gap between leaders and the public. By the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, U.S. combat troops were finally leaving Vietnam, not in triumph, not in defeat on the battlefield, but in disengagement, marking the end of America's direct war while leaving South Vietnam exposed, unstable, and increasingly alone, as the final reckoning loomed just beyond the horizon. In early 1975, what remained of South Vietnam collapsed with shocking speed as North Vietnamese forces advanced almost unopposed, exposing how fragile the post-American war effort had become once U.S. air power, money and manpower were removed from the equation. Cities fell one by one, refugees flooded the roads, and panic spread through Saigon as officials, soldiers and civilians realized there would be no last-minute rescue, no reversal, and no return of American forces to stop what was now inevitable. The evacuation of the U.S. Embassy became the defining image of the war's end. Helicopters lifting off rooftops as desperate crowds gathered below, symbolizing not just defeat, but abandonment, confusion, and the human cost of a war that ended without resolution or ceremony. When Saigon fell on 30 April 1975, Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, while those associated with the former South Vietnamese government faced imprisonment, re-education camps, or flight, triggering a refugee crisis that would echo for decades. For the United States, Vietnam left scars that went far beyond the battlefield, over 58,000 dead, a generation distrustful of government, a military forced to rethink doctrine and limits, and a public permanently wary of wars sold with certainty, but fought without clarity. Vietnam was not lost in a single battle or moment, but through years of misjudgment, escalation and denial, and its legacy endures as a warning that overwhelming power cannot guarantee victory, that belief matters as much as firepower, and that once a war loses its meaning, the cost continues long after the fighting stops.